The dream trip began. Sarah Mitchell had been counting down the days for months. Her small apartment in Dayton, Ohio was covered with London guidebooks, travel maps, and printed photos of Big Ben, Tower Bridge, and Buckingham Palace. At 28, she had finally saved enough money from her teaching job to take the trip of a lifetime. Every summer tutoring session, every weekend of grading papers, and every dollar she had carefully put aside was worth this moment. The flight from Cincinnati to London Heathrow felt like the longest 8 hours of her life. Sarah barely slept, too excited about what awaited her. She had planned every detail of her 7-day trip.
You're what?
Day 1 would be the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey. Day 2 was the British Museum and a walk through Hyde Park. But Day 3 was special. That was Buckingham Palace Day. The one she had been looking forward to most. Sarah had always been fascinated by the British royal family. As a little girl, she had watched Princess Diana's wedding on television with her grandmother. She had a collection of royal memorabilia at home, including teacups with Queen Elizabeth's face on them and books about royal history. Her friends often teased her about her royal obsession, but Sarah didn't care. There was something magical about the tradition, the ceremony, and the history of it all. When she finally arrived at her small hotel near Victoria Station, Sarah was exhausted but thrilled. The old building smelled like tea and furniture polish, and her room was tiny compared to American standards, but she loved every inch of it. The flowered wallpaper, the small window overlooking a narrow street, and even the old radiator that made strange noises during the night, everything felt authentically British to her. Her first 2 days in London went exactly as planned. Tower of London amazed her with its dark history and glittering crown jewels. Westminster Abbey made her feel small and humble as she walked where kings and queens had been crowned for centuries. The British Museum overwhelmed her with its treasures from around the world. But through it all, she kept thinking about Day 3 and her visit to Buckingham Palace. Sarah had done her research. She knew the palace had 775 rooms and that the Queen used it as her official residence when she was in London. About the changing of the guard ceremony and the famous balcony where the royal family appeared for special occasions. But what excited her most were the Queen's guards, those famous soldiers in their red coats and tall black hats who stood perfectly still no matter what happened around them. The night before her palace visit, Sarah called her best friend Jenny, back in Ohio. "I can't believe I'm finally here," she said, looking out her hotel window at the London streets below. "Tomorrow I'm going to see the guards everyone talks about." Jenny laughed on the other end of the phone. "Oh, those guys, Sarah, you know. They're just for show, right? They're like living decorations. I saw a video online where tourists were taking selfies with them and they didn't even blink. They're not real soldiers. They're basically actors in fancy costumes." This conversation stuck with Sarah as she got ready for bed. She had always thought the guards were real military personnel, but Jenny seemed so confident about them being just for tourism. Maybe her friend was right. Maybe they were more like the characters at Disney World. People dressed up to entertain visitors and pose for photos. Sarah woke up early on her 3rd day. She was too excited to sleep any longer. She put on her favorite blue dress and comfortable walking shoes, grabbed her camera, and headed out into the London morning. The weather was perfect, sunny, but not too warm. Just enough clouds to make the sky interesting for photographs. As she walked from her hotel toward Buckingham Palace, Sarah noticed how the city was waking up around her. Office workers hurried past with their morning coffee, street vendors were setting up their stalls, and red double-decker buses rumbled down the streets. Everything felt like a movie to her, so different from the quiet suburban streets of Dayton. The closer she got to the palace, the more tourists she saw. People from all over the world were walking in the same direction, cameras in hand, excited. Chatter filling the air in dozens of different languages. Sarah felt part of something bigger. Part of the millions of people who came to London every year to see this famous place. When Buckingham Palace finally came into view, Sarah stopped walking and just stared. Photos and videos had never captured how impressive it really was. The building seemed to stretch forever, with its pale stone walls, dozens of windows, and the famous balcony she had seen in so many news reports. The gates were decorated with gold details that sparkled in the morning sun. The courtyard beyond looked like something from a fairy tale. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately were the guards. Even from a distance, she could see the bright red uniforms and tall black hats. They stood so perfectly still that they almost looked like statues. Other tourists were already gathering near them, pointing and taking pictures. But the guards didn't seem to notice or care about any of the attention. Sarah found herself walking faster, eager to get closer and see these famous guards up close. She had her camera ready and was already thinking about the photos she would post on social media. Her friends back home would be so jealous when they saw her pictures from Buckingham Palace. As she approached the palace gates, Sarah joined the crowd of tourists who were walking along the fence trying to get the best views and photos. Some people were pressed against the iron bars, others were holding their cameras up high to get shots over people's heads. Children were being lifted up by their parents to see better, and tour guides were pointing out different features of the palace to their groups. The atmosphere was festive and excited. Everyone seemed happy to be there, and Sarah felt caught up in the energy of it all. This was exactly what she had dreamed about during all those months of saving money and planning. She was really here, at Buckingham Palace, about to see the famous Queen's guards in person. Sarah pulled out her phone to start taking pictures, but she wanted to get closer first. She wanted to see every detail of the guards' uniforms, to capture the perfect shot that would show everyone back home just how amazing this experience was. Little did she know that her enthusiasm and her friends' casual comments about the guards, being just for show, were about to lead her into a situation she would never forget. First impressions of the guards, Sarah pushed through the crowd of tourists, her camera held high as she tried to get closer to the famous Queen's guards. The morning sun was getting stronger, and she could feel the excitement building in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been dreaming about for months, when she finally got close enough to see the guards clearly. Sarah was struck by how impressive they looked. The guard nearest to her was tall and broad-shouldered, standing perfectly, straight with his rifle held at exactly the right angle. His red tunic was immaculate, with bright gold buttons that caught the sunlight. The white straps across his chest were perfectly positioned, and his black pants had a razor-sharp crease down the front. But it was the bearskin hat that really caught Sarah's attention. She had seen pictures of these famous hats, but seeing one in person was completely different. It was much taller than she had expected, adding at least a foot to the guard's already impressive height. The black fur looked thick and heavy, and Sarah wondered how the guards managed to wear them in warm weather without getting overheated. The guard's face was what fascinated her most. His expression was completely neutral, not friendly, not unfriendly, just blank. His eyes looked straight ahead, never moving to the left or right, never acknowledging the crowds of people taking his picture just a few feet away. It was like he was looking at something far in the distance that only he could see. Sarah raised her camera and took several shots, but she wasn't completely satisfied with them. Other tourists kept walking in front of her, blocking her view at the crucial moment. Children were running around, and adults were constantly moving back and forth trying to get their own perfect photos. She needed to get closer if she wanted the kind of picture that would really impress her friends back home. As she moved nearer to the guard, Sarah noticed more details about his uniform. The red wool looked heavy and hot, especially for a sunny day like today. Gold braiding decorated the front of his jacket. She could see that every button and buckle was polished to a perfect shine. His black boots were so shiny she could almost see her reflection in them. What surprised Sarah most was how young the guard looked. Despite his serious expression and perfect posture, she could tell he was probably only in his early 20s, maybe even younger than she was. This made her think even more that Jenny had been right. Surely someone so young couldn't be a real soldier with important responsibilities. He was probably just a college student with a part-time job dressing up for tourists. Other tourists around her seemed to have the same idea. Sarah watched as people posed next to the guards, making funny faces and silly gestures, while their friends took pictures. Some visitors were trying to get the guards to react by waving at them, making loud noises, or even calling out jokes. But the guards never responded to any of it. "See," said an American woman standing near Sarah. They're not allowed to move or talk. It's all just an act for the tourists. They're like the guys who dress up as superheroes in Times Square. This comment made Sarah feel more confident about getting closer. If the guards were just performers putting on a show for visitors, then surely they wouldn't mind if she got a better photo. She had come all the way from Ohio for this trip, and she deserved to get the perfect picture. Sarah noticed that some tourists were getting much closer than others. A group of teenagers was standing right next to one guard, laughing and taking selfies. An older man was examining the guard's rifle from just inches away, pointing out details to his wife. If they could get that close, surely she could too. She waited for a gap in the crowd and then quickly stepped forward, positioning herself right beside the guard she had been photographing. Up close, he was even more impressive. Sarah could see individual threads in his uniform and smell the polish on his boots. She could even see him breathing, though. His chest barely moved and his expression never changed. Being so close to the guard made Sarah realize just how still he really was. She had thought the stories about guards not moving were exaggerated, but this man was like a statue. His eyes never blinked, his mouth never twitched, and his hands never shifted their grip on his rifle. It was almost supernatural how motionless he could be. Sarah held up her camera to take a close-up shot, but just as she was about to press the button, a large tour group walked right in front of her. She sighed in frustration and lowered her camera. Getting the perfect photo was turning out to be harder than she had expected. While she waited for the tour group to move on, Sarah found herself studying the guard's face more closely. His blank expression, she thought she could see something in his eyes, a kind of alertness that suggested he was very aware of everything happening around him, even if he wasn't showing it. This made her wonder if maybe the guards were more than just actors after all. But then she remembered what Jenny had said about them being just for show, and she pushed these doubts aside. The important thing was getting her photo, not worrying about whether the guards were real soldiers or not. The tour group finally moved on, and Sarah raised her camera again. This time she was determined to get the shot she wanted. She stepped even closer to the guard, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his uniform if she wanted to, through her camera lens. Sarah could see every detail of the guard's face. His skin was pale, probably from spending hours standing in the shade of his heavy hat. There were tiny beads of sweat on his forehead, which made sense given how hot his uniform must be. But his expression remained completely unchanged. Sarah took several photos from different angles, each time stepping a little closer to get a better shot. She was so focused on her photography that she didn't notice the way the guard's jaw had tightened slightly, or how his grip on his rifle had shifted almost imperceptibly. Other tourists were watching her now, some of them taking pictures of her. Taking pictures of the guard? Sarah felt like a celebrity, and the attention made her even bolder. If everyone was watching her, she might as well give them something interesting to see. That's when Sarah got the idea that would change everything. Looking at the guard's serious, stoic expression, she suddenly thought how funny it would be to get a photo of herself giving him a big, friendly hug. It would be the perfect contrast, her genuine American smile and enthusiasm against his rigid British formality. The more Sarah thought about it, the more the idea appealed to her. It would definitely be a unique photo, something none of her friends back home would have. She imagined posting it on social media with a caption like "Making friends with the Queen's Guard" or "American tourist meets British tradition." Sarah looked around to make sure other people were watching. She wanted witnesses to this moment of international friendship. Several tourists had their cameras pointed in her direction, and she could see people smiling as they waited to see what she would do next. The guard continued to stare straight ahead, completely oblivious to what Sarah was planning. His stillness and apparent lack of awareness made her even more confident that he wouldn't mind a quick, friendly hug. After all, if he was just an actor playing a role, surely he would appreciate the interaction with a tourist who had traveled so far to see him. The decision to act. Sarah stood just a few feet away from the Queen's Guard, her heart beating faster as the idea of hugging him became more and more appealing. The morning crowd around Buckingham Palace was getting thicker, with tourists from every corner of the world pointing cameras and phones in every direction. The atmosphere was festive and relaxed, and Sarah felt caught up in the holiday spirit of it all. She looked at the guard one more time, taking in his perfect posture and unchanging expression. He really did look like a statue, she thought. His eyes stared straight ahead at some invisible point in the distance, never acknowledging the dozens of people taking his picture. His breathing was so controlled and quiet that Sarah had to look closely to even see his chest moving. He probably gets tired of standing there all day, Sarah said to herself, trying to rationalize what she was thinking about doing. A little human contact might actually be nice for him. Americans are known for being friendly. Maybe I can brighten his day. The tourists around her were becoming more adventurous too. Sarah watched as a middle-aged man from what sounded like Germany stepped close to another guard and made bunny ears behind his head while his wife took a photo.
Ollie the guard.
Didn't react at all.
Ow.
A group of teenagers were taking turns posing next to a third guard, making silly faces and laughing loudly. Again, no reaction. This convinced Sarah even more that the guards were just there for entertainment. Real soldiers would never allow tourists to behave like this around them, she reasoned. These had to be actors or part-time performers, just like Jenny had said. Sarah pulled out her phone to check the time. She had been at the palace for almost an hour. She still didn't have the one special photo that would make this trip memorable. All of her pictures so far were the same ones that thousands of other tourists took every day. She needed something unique, something that would make her friends back in Ohio say, "Wow, I can't believe you did that." A woman standing near Sarah was talking loudly to her husband about the guards. "I read online that they're not allowed to move or speak no matter what happens," she said in a thick Australian accent. "They're trained to ignore everything around them. It's all part of the show." This comment made Sarah feel even more confident. If the guards were trained to ignore everything around them, then surely they were trained to handle tourists who wanted to interact with them. A quick, friendly hug wouldn't hurt anyone. It might even be welcomed after hours of standing still and being stared at. Sarah blinked around at the other tourists and noticed that many of them seemed to be waiting for something interesting to happen. Some had their cameras ready, pointed in her general direction, as if they sensed that she was planning something. This audience made her feel both nervous and excited. If she was going to do something bold, at least there would be plenty of people to capture the moment. She took a step closer to the guard. Close enough now that she could see individual threads in his red tunic and the tiny scratches on the brass buttons. The guard's face remained completely expressionless, but Sarah thought she noticed his eyes flicker slightly in her direction. For just a moment, she wondered if maybe he was more aware of her presence than he was letting on. But the moment passed, and the guard's gaze returned to its fixed position, staring straight ahead. Sarah convinced herself that any movement she might have seen was just her imagination. The guard was clearly in some kind of trance-like state, probably thinking about anything except the tourists around him. "Excuse me, miss," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see an elderly British gentleman with a kind face and a walking stick. "You might want to be a bit more careful around the guards. They're on duty, you know." The man's warning made Sarah pause for a moment. He seemed to know more about the guards than the other tourists, and his serious tone suggested that maybe they weren't just actors after all. But then Sarah looked back at the guard, who still hadn't moved a muscle, despite all the noise and activity around him. "They're just for tourists, aren't they?" Sarah asked the gentleman. "I mean, they don't actually do anything important." The older man's eyebrows went up, and he looked surprised by her question. "Oh, my dear, they're very real soldiers. The Queen's Guard are some of the finest military personnel in Britain. They've served in Afghanistan, Iraq, all over the world. This ceremonial duty is just one of their responsibilities." This information made Sarah feel less certain about her plan. But she had come so far and had been thinking about this moment for so long that she didn't want to give up now. Maybe the old man was exaggerating about how important the guards were. After all, if they were really such important soldiers, why would they let tourists get so close to them? Sarah thanked the gentleman politely but didn't step away from the guard. She had noticed that despite his warning, other tourists were still behaving pretty casually around the guards. If there were really strict rules about not interacting with them, surely there would be barriers or signs to keep people away. The sun was getting higher in the sky, and Sarah could see that the guard was starting to show signs of the heat. There, were more drops of sweat on his forehead now, and she thought his breathing might be getting slightly heavier. The heavy wool uniform and tall bearskin hat must be incredibly uncomfortable on a day like this. This made Sarah feel even more sympathetic toward the guard. Standing perfectly still for hours in heavy clothing, under the warm sun, couldn't be pleasant. No matter how well-trained someone was, a quick, friendly hug from an appreciative tourist might actually be a nice break from the monotony of his duty. Sarah looked at her watch again. She'd been standing near the guard for almost 20 minutes, and she was starting to feel like she needed to either do something or move on. Other tourists were beginning to stare at her, probably wondering why she was just standing there instead of taking pictures and moving along like everyone else. The crowd around her seemed to sense that something was about to happen. People had their cameras pointed in her direction, and she could hear whispered conversations in different languages. A family with small children had stopped nearby. The kids were looking back and forth between Sarah and the guard with curious expressions. This attention made Sarah feel like she was on stage, and the performer in her couldn't resist the opportunity to give the audience something memorable. She had always been the kind of person who wasn't afraid to be the center of attention. In high school, she had been in the drama club. In college, she was always the one who would get up and dance at parties when everyone else was too shy. Life's too short to play it safe, Sarah told herself, remembering something her grandmother used to say. When you're traveling, you have to make memories that will last forever. Sarah took one more look around to make sure she had an audience then. Took a deep breath and made her decision. She was going to give this stoic British guard a big, warm American hug. It would be a moment of international friendship, a bridge between two cultures, and definitely the most unique photo from her entire London trip. The guard continued to stare straight ahead, completely unaware of what Sarah was planning. His rifle remained at precisely the correct angle. His posture was still perfect, and his expression hadn't changed since she first saw him. Everything about his demeanor suggested that he was lost in his own thoughts. Probably counting down the minutes until his shift was over, Sarah smiled at the thought of how surprised, probably pleased he would be to receive a friendly gesture from a visitor who had traveled thousands of miles just to see him. She positioned herself at the perfect angle for the cameras that were now definitely pointed in her direction. Took one final deep breath and prepared to make her move. The moment of contact, Sarah's heart was pounding as she took her final step toward the Queen's Guard. The morning sun felt warm on her back, and she could hear the excited murmur of tourists around her who had started to realize that something unusual was about to happen. Camera phones were being raised, and she could see people nudging their companions to pay attention. The guard stood perfectly still, just as he had for the past hour. His red tunic was immaculate, despite the growing heat of the day, and his bearskin hat cast a shadow over his pale face. Sarah could see tiny beads of sweat on his forehead, but his expression remained completely neutral. His rifle was held at exactly the same angle it had been since she first saw him, and his eyes continued to stare at that invisible point in the distance. "Here goes nothing," Sarah whispered to herself. And then she opened her arms wide and stepped forward to embrace the guard. The moment her arms made contact with the guard's shoulders, Sarah knew immediately that she had made a terrible mistake. What she had expected to be a soft, warm hug against someone who might even hug. Her back turned into something completely different. The guard's body was rigid as steel. His muscles were so tense that hugging him felt like trying to embrace a statue made of iron. There was no give in his posture, no acknowledgement of her presence, but Sarah could feel an immediate change in his energy that made her stomach drop. With fear, for just a split second, everything seemed frozen in time. Sarah's arms were around the guard's shoulders, her face pressed against the rough wool of his red tunic. She could smell the starch in his uniform and the leather of his equipment. The guard's breathing, which had been slow and controlled, seemed to stop entirely. Then everything happened at once. "Get back." The guard's voice exploded like a thunderclap, so loud and commanding that Sarah felt it in her chest as much as she heard it. The sound was nothing like she had expected. Not polite or gentle, but sharp and dangerous, like the bark of a military drill sergeant. Sarah jumped backward so fast that she nearly fell over. Her arms flew away from the guard as if she had touched something burning. The friendly smile that had been on her face disappeared instantly, replaced by shock and growing terror. But the guard wasn't finished. In one fluid, lightning-fast motion, he brought his rifle down from its ceremonial position and pointed it directly at Sarah's chest. The bayonet at the end of the rifle gleamed wickedly in the sunlight, and Sarah realized with horror that it was razor-sharp and very real. "Move back now," the guard commanded, his voice even louder than before. His face, which had been expressionless for so long, was now transformed into something fierce and intimidating. His eyes, which had been staring passively into the distance, were now locked onto Sarah's, with an intensity that made her feel like prey being stalked by a predator. Sarah stumbled backward, her legs suddenly feeling weak and unsteady. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She tried to say, "I'm sorry," but her voice seemed to have disappeared entirely. The friendly, casual atmosphere she had been feeling just moments before was completely gone, replaced by a fear she had never experienced. Before, the other tourists around them reacted with gasps and screams. Some people started running away from the scene, while others pressed forward to get a better view. Camera phones that had been ready to capture a cute tourist photo were now recording what looked like a serious security incident. "I didn't mean ... Sarah finally managed to whisper, but her words were lost in the noise of the crowd's reaction. The guard's rifle remained pointed directly at her, unwavering and deadly serious. Sarah could see his finger near the trigger, and she realized that this was not a joke or a performance. This was a highly trained soldier who considered her a potential threat, and he was prepared to defend his post by any means necessary. "Step away from the Queen's Guard," came another voice, this one from somewhere behind Sarah. She spun around to see two police officers running toward the scene, their hands on their weapons. The officers were moving fast, pushing through the crowd of tourists with urgent determination. Sarah felt trapped between the guard with his rifle and the approaching police officers. Her mind was racing, trying to understand how her simple, friendly gesture had turned into such a dangerous situation. Just moments ago, she had been thinking about posting a cute photo on social media. Now she was surrounded by weapons and shouting, voices, and she honestly wasn't sure if she was about to be arrested or shot. The guard's eyes never left Sarah's face. She could see that despite his aggressive posture and threatening weapon, he was completely in control of himself. This wasn't someone who had lost his temper or panicked. This was a professional soldier doing exactly what he had been trained to do when someone got too close to his post. "Please," Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out as barely. More than a whisper, "I'm just a tourist, I didn't know... Remain where you are," one of the police officers shouted as he approached. Sarah didn't dare move, caught between the guard's rifle and the officer's commands. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, with people running from other parts of the palace grounds to see what was happening. Sarah could hear voices in dozens of different languages, all expressing shock and confusion. Some people were still taking pictures and videos, turning her moment of terror into entertainment for social media. Sarah's legs felt like they might give out at any moment. The reality of her situation was starting to sink in. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a smile and an apology. She had apparently committed some kind of serious offense against a member of the Queen's Guard. And the response was swift and overwhelming. The guard's breathing was still controlled and steady, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw and the way his grip on the rifle had tightened. He was ready for anything, prepared to defend his post against what he clearly considered a genuine threat to his duty. "I'm American," Sarah said desperately, as if her nationality might somehow explain or excuse her behavior. "I'm just a tourist. I didn't mean any harm." The police officers were closer now, and Sarah could see that they were taking the situation very seriously. Their expressions were grim and professional, and they moved with the same kind of controlled urgency that the guard was displaying. This wasn't something they were treating as a simple tourist mistake. Sarah thought about her friends back home. About Jenny, who had told her the guards were just for show. She thought about her comfortable teaching job in Ohio, about her small apartment and her quiet life. had a simple vacation photo turned into the most terrifying moment of her life. The guard's rifle remained perfectly steady, pointed directly at her heart. His eyes were cold and alert, watching for any sign that she might try to approach him again or make any sudden movements. Sarah realized that in this moment, she wasn't a friendly tourist from America. She was a potential threat to the security of Buckingham Palace, and she was being treated accordingly. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade into the background as Sarah stared at the bayonet pointed at her chest. She had never seen a weapon up close before, never been in any kind of dangerous situation. The sharp metal gleaming in the sunlight was the most frightening thing she had ever seen, and the knowledge that it was pointed at her by someone trained to use it made her feel sick with terror. All she had wanted was a unique photo to remember. Her dream trip to London. Instead, she had created a nightmare that was being recorded by dozens of cameras and would probably haunt her for the rest of her life. The aftermath and understanding: the police officers reached Sarah within seconds, though it felt like hours to her. The first officer, a tall woman with short blonde hair, immediately positioned herself between Sarah and the guard's rifle, while her partner moved to Sarah's side. Both officers were calm, but clearly taking the situation very seriously. "Miss, I need you to put your hands where I can see them and step back slowly," the female officer said in a firm but not unkind voice. Sarah's hands were already shaking as she raised them. She took several careful steps backward, never taking her eyes off the guard's weapon. The guard maintained his defensive position for another few moments, his rifle still pointed toward where Sarah had been standing. His eyes swept the area around him, checking for any other potential threats, before he slowly returned his weapon to its ceremonial position. The transformation was remarkable in just seconds. He went from being a fierce warrior back to the statue-like figure Sarah had first encountered, but Sarah could never look at him the same way again. She had seen what lay beneath the ceremonial exterior, and it terrified her. This wasn't an actor or a tourist attraction. This was a highly trained soldier who had been prepared to use deadly force to protect his post. "Are you injured, miss?" the second officer asked, a middle-aged man with a kind face but serious eyes. Sarah shook her head, not trusting her voice to work properly. Her whole body was shaking now, the adrenaline and fear making it impossible to stand still. The crowd of tourists was still gathering, many of them holding up phones and cameras to record the scene. Sarah realized with horror that her moment of humiliation and terror was probably already being uploaded to social media platforms around the world. The photo she had wanted so badly was happening, but not at all the way she had imagined. "Going to need to see some identification," the female officer said gently. Sarah fumbled in her purse for her passport, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely hold it. When she finally managed to hand it over, the officer examined it carefully. "American tourist," the officer said to her partner. "Sarah Mitchell. From Ohio?" She looked back at Sarah with a slightly softer expression. "Miss Mitchell, do you understand what just happened here?" Sarah tried to speak, but could only manage a whispered no. She honestly didn't understand. One moment she had been trying to take a friendly photo, and the next moment she was facing a rifle and surrounded by police. The whole situation felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in movies, not to a small-town teacher. "From Ohio?" The male officer stepped closer, his voice patient but serious. "Miss Mitchell, what you just did was attempt to physically contact a member of the Queen's Guard while he was on active duty. These soldiers are responsible for the security of Buckingham Palace and the royal family. Any unauthorized contact is treated as a potential security threat." "But I was just trying to hug him," Sarah said, her voice still barely above a whisper. "I thought... My friend told me they were just for show." The officers exchanged a look that Sarah couldn't interpret. The female officer handed Sarah's passport back to her and said, "Miss Mitchell, the Queen's Guard are elite soldiers from some of Britain's most prestigious regiments. They've served in combat zones around the world. The ceremonial duty is an honor, not a performance." As the officer spoke, Sarah became aware of the guard she had tried to hug. He had returned to his original position and posture, but she could see sweat running down his face from under his bearskin hat. The incident had clearly taken a toll on him too, though he showed no sign of it in his expression or stance. "Will I be arrested?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. She imagined trying to explain to her school principal why she needed time off for a court appearance in London, or how she would tell her parents that their daughter was in jail in a foreign country. The officers looked at each other again, then back at Sarah. That depends on several factors, the male officer said. You're clearly a tourist who made an honest mistake, but what you did was still a serious breach of security protocol. A new voice joined the conversation. Officers, if I may? Sarah turned to see the elderly British gentleman who had tried to warn her earlier. He approached the group with his walking stick, moving slowly, but with dignity. This is Professor Williams, the female officer said, apparently recognizing him. He's one of our regular palace historians. Professor Williams nodded to the officers, then looked at Sarah with a mixture of sympathy and disappointment. Young lady, I tried to warn you earlier. These guards aren't tourist attractions. They're serving soldiers with real responsibilities. Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. I'm so sorry, she said, looking back at the guard who continued to stare straight ahead as if nothing had happened. I really didn't know. My friend back home told me they were just actors. Professor Williams sighed deeply. A common misconception among tourists. These men and women are members of the Household Division, the Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Irish Guards, and Welsh Guards. They're some of the most elite infantry regiments in the AS. British Army. The professor gestured toward the guard with his walking stick. That young man there has likely served multiple tours in Afghanistan or other conflict zones. He's been trained in close combat, weapons handling, and threat assessment. When you approached him in an unexpected way, his military training kicked. And immediately, Sarah looked at the guard with new understanding and growing shame. She had seen him as a prop for her vacation photos. But he was actually someone who had risked his life for his country and was now serving in one of the most prestigious positions in the British military. The ceremonial duties here at Buckingham Palace are considered a great honor, Professor Williams continued. These soldiers maintain the traditions that go back centuries, while also serving as genuine security for the royal family. Not allowed to break character or acknowledge tourists because they're on duty, not because they're pretending to be statues. The female officer looked at her watch and then at Sarah. Miss Mitchell, I'm going to need you to come with us to answer some questions. This incident will need to be documented, and Palace security will want to review what happened. Sarah's heart sank. She had visions of missing her flight home, of international incidents, of her face on the news as the American tourist who attacked a British guard. The vacation of her dreams was turning into the nightmare of her life. However, the officer continued, given that you're clearly a tourist who made an honest mistake, and given that no actual harm was done, it's likely this will be treated as a minor incident. You'll probably receive a warning and be asked to leave the palace grounds for today. This small piece of good news didn't make Sarah feel much better. She was still shaking, still horrified by what she had done, and still completely humiliated by the scene she had caused. The crowd of tourists was still watching, still taking pictures and videos that would probably end up on the internet within hours. Professor Williams stepped closer to Sarah, his voice gentler now. My dear, I can see you're genuinely sorry about what happened. The important thing is that you learned from this experience. These guards deserve our respect, not our casual treatment. Sarah nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. I feel terrible. Never meant to disrespect him or put anyone in danger. Just wanted a nice photo for my trip. I understand, the professor said kindly. But perhaps this will help you understand something important about British culture. We take our traditions and our military very seriously. What might seem like a casual photo opportunity to a tourist is actually a solemn duty for these soldiers. As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at the guard she had tried to hug. He stood perfectly still in the growing heat, sweat visible on his face, but his expression unchanged. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he was angry at her or just doing his job. She wondered about his family, his background, what battles he might have fought before coming to stand guard at Buckingham Palace. The weight of her mistake was becoming clearer with each passing moment. She hadn't just embarrassed herself or broken a rule. She had treated a decorated soldier like a theme park character, had invaded his personal space while he was serving his country, and had created a security incident at one of the most important buildings in Britain. "Come along, Miss Mitchell," the female officer said, not unkindly. "Let's get this sorted out." As Sarah walked away from the scene, accompanied by the two police officers, she could hear the murmur of the crowd behind her. Tourists were already telling the story to their friends, probably posting on social media, turning her moment of shame into their entertainment. The guard remained at his post, as still and professional as ever. Sarah realized that in a few hours, when his shift ended, he would probably go home to his family or his barracks. And this incident would just be one of many strange encounters he had experienced while on ceremonial duty. For her, it would be a memory that would last forever. Professor Williams walked alongside them for a few steps. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, "when you get home, I hope you'll tell people about what you learned today. I'll put other tourists. Understand that these guards aren't here for their entertainment?" Sarah nodded, too ashamed to speak. She thought about Jenny back in Ohio, about the casual way her friend had dismissed the guards as just for show. She thought about all the other tourists she had seen behaving inappropriately around the guards, making jokes and treating them like objects rather than people. As they walked toward the police station, Sarah realized that her London vacation had taught her something much more valuable than she had expected. She had learned about respect, about tradition, and about the difference between tourism and cultural understanding. This wasn't the lesson she had planned to learn, but it was perhaps the most important one of her life. Lessons learned in going home. The police station was nothing like the dramatic interrogation rooms Sarah had seen in movies. Instead, she found herself in a small, clean office with fluorescent lighting and the smell of instant coffee. The female officer, who had introduced herself as Constable Davies, sat across from her at a simple desk, while her partner, Constable Thompson, stood nearby, taking notes. "Right then, Miss Mitchell," Constable Davies said, opening a folder. "Let's go through what happened step by step. I want you to tell me everything you were thinking and why you decided to approach the guard." For the next hour, Sarah told her story. She explained about her dream trip to London, about saving money for months to make it happen, about her excitement at finally seeing Buckingham Palace. She told them about Jenny's comments back in Ohio, about how she had believed the guards were just actors in costumes. The officers listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Sarah could tell they had dealt with similar situations before, though probably not many quite as dramatic as hers had become. "You have to understand, Miss Mitchell," Constable Thompson said when she finished her story, "that we get thousands of tourists here every day. Most of them are respectful and follow the guidelines, but some treat this place like a theme park. The guards endure a lot of inappropriate behavior, but what you did crossed a line into potential physical assault." What? Sarah winced at the word assault. She had never thought of her intended hug in those terms, but she was beginning to understand how her actions must have looked from the guard's perspective. A stranger had suddenly grabbed him while he was trying to do his job, and he had no way of knowing what her intentions were. "The guard you approached is Lance Corporal James Morrison," Constable Davies said, reading from a file. "He's 20 years old, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and has been with the Coldstream Guards for 6 years. This ceremonial posting is considered a privilege that he earned through distinguished service." Learning the guard's name and background made Sarah feel even worse. Lance Corporal Morrison wasn't just a faceless figure in a red coat. He was a real person with a real military record. Someone who had risked his life for his country and deserved better treatment than she had given him. "Will he get in trouble because of what happened?" Sarah asked, worried that her actions might have consequences for the soldier she had already wronged. "No," Constable Thompson assured her, responded exactly as he was trained to do. If anything, his quick reaction probably prevented a more serious situation from developing. The questioning continued for another 30 minutes with the officers, documenting every detail of the incident. Sarah signed several forms and was fingerprinted, though the officers assured her this was just procedure and wouldn't result in a criminal record. "Here's what's going to happen, Miss Mitchell," Constable Davies said finally. "You're going to receive an official warning, and you're banned from the Buckingham Palace grounds for the remainder of your stay in London. This incident will be filed with Palace security, but given your cooperation and obvious remorse, no formal charges will be pressed." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by a deeper sadness.
Oh.
She wouldn't be arrested or deported, but her dream of seeing Buckingham Palace was over. The place she had been most excited to visit was now off limits to her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know. I don't deserve your kindness after what I did." "Everyone makes mistakes, miss," Constable Thompson said with a slight smile. "The important thing is learning from them." When Sarah finally left the police station 3 hours later, the sun was high in the sky, and London was bustling with afternoon activity. She felt drained and emotionally exhausted, but also strangely clearer about things than she had been in the morning. She walked slowly back toward her hotel, taking a different route that avoided Buckingham Palace entirely. Along the way, she passed other tourist attractions, Big Ben, Westminster Abbey, the London Eye, but none of them seemed as appealing as they had just a few days ago. The incident with the guard had changed something fundamental about how she saw her role as a tourist in someone else's country. Back in her hotel room, Sarah sat on her small bed and tried to process everything that had happened. She picked up her phone to call Jenny back in Ohio, then put it down again. How could she explain what had happened? How could she make her friend understand that her casual comments about the guards being just for show had contributed to such a serious misunderstanding? Instead, Sarah opened her laptop and began to write. She started with an email to her family, explaining what had happened and apologizing for the worry she knew it would cause them. Then she wrote a longer piece, trying to capture everything she had learned about respect, cultural differences, and the importance of understanding before acting. Over the next few days, Sarah's remaining time in London took on a completely different character. Instead of rushing from tourist attraction to tourist attraction, she spent more time talking to local people, learning about British history and culture, trying to understand the context behind the things she was seeing. She visited the Imperial War Museum and spent hours reading about the regiments that provided the Queen's Guard. She learned about their battle honors, their traditions, and the sacrifices made by soldiers like Lance Corporal Morrison. She began to understand that the ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace weren't separate from military service. They were a continuation of it. At a small cafe near her hotel, Sarah struck up a conversation with an elderly man who turned out to be a retired sergeant from the Welsh Guards. When she told him about her experience at the palace, he listened without judgment. "The lad did his job properly," the retired sergeant said simply. "That's what we train them for, to respond to threats while maintaining the dignity of the uniform. You gave him quite a surprise, I'm sure, but he handled it by the book." "I feel terrible about it," Sarah admitted. "I never meant to disrespect him or cause problems." The old soldier smiled kindly. "The fact that you feel bad about it tells me you're a decent person who made an honest mistake. The important thing is that you've learned something. That's more than we can say for a lot of tourists." On her last day in London, Sarah found herself walking past the gates of Buckingham Palace again, though she was careful to stay on the opposite side of the street. She could see the guards at their posts, standing as still and professional as ever. From a distance, she tried to see if Lance Corporal Morrison was among them. But of course she couldn't tell one guard from another. She watched other tourists approaching the guards, taking pictures and making comments. Most were respectful, but she saw several people getting too close or making inappropriate jokes. It's time she felt a pang of understanding for what the guards had to endure every day. Sarah took out her phone and took one final photo, not of the guards, but of the palace itself. Focusing on the architecture and the beauty of the building rather than the people protecting it. It wasn't the picture she had originally planned to take, but it felt more honest somehow on the flight back to Cincinnati. Sarah spent most of the time writing in her journal about her London experience. She wrote about the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey, about the kindness of Professor Williams and the professionalism of the police officers, about the retired sergeant who had helped her understand military culture. But mostly she wrote about Lance Corporal Morrison and what she had learned about respect, about cultural differences, and about the danger of making assumptions about people whose lives and experiences were different from her own. When she finally arrived back in Dayton, Ohio, Jenny was waiting to pick her up at the airport, eager to hear stories about the trip. As they drove through the familiar streets of their hometown, Jenny peppered Sarah with questions about London, about the sights she had seen, and the photos she had taken. "So, did you get that picture with the Queen's Guard?" Jenny asked with a laugh. "I bet that was hilarious." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the American suburbs pass by outside the car window. Then she began to tell Jenny about Lance Corporal Morrison, about Professor Williams, about everything she had learned during those few terrifying and enlightening moments at Buckingham Palace. By the time they reached Sarah's apartment, Jenny's attitude had completely changed. "I had no idea they were real soldiers," she said quietly. "I feel terrible for telling you they were just actors." "We both learned something," Sarah said. "The important thing is that we don't make the same mistake again." Back at school the following week, Sarah's fellow teachers were curious about her London vacation. She showed them pictures of Big Ben and Westminster Abbey, talked about the museums she had visited and the history she had learned. But she was careful to tell them about the guards too, about their real role and the respect they deserved. "I used to think they were just tourist attractions," she told her colleagues, "but they're actually some of Britain's most elite soldiers. They've served in wars, risked their lives for their country, and deserve our respect." Sarah never did post any pictures of the Queen's Guards on social media. Instead, she kept her photos of the palace architecture, the gardens, and the history she had learned to appreciate in a new way. Occasionally, she would think about Lance Corporal Morrison and wonder how many other tourists had tried to treat him like a prop for their vacation photos. The incident at Buckingham Palace had lasted only a few minutes, but it changed how Sarah thought about travel, about cultural respect, and about the real people behind the tourist attractions. It wasn't the vacation memory she had planned to bring home, but it was perhaps the most valuable lesson of her life.